Okay, up next, it's a great pleasure to introduce you all to DriverCheck's very own Shauna Mann. Shauna is our regional manager of Western Canada Clinics. She's a physical therapist with 22 years of experience, although she looks 16, specializing in orthopaedics and musculoskeletal assessments, with 10 of those being in the occupational health industry. Shauna has widespread experience in injury prevention and management sector, with a focus on post-offer employment testing, return-to-duty testing, developing personal injury prevention programs, functional capacity evaluations, ergonomics, and physical demands analysis. That's a long list. She's also a certified health coach, life coach, and nutrition coach. She'll be talking to us about physical abilities testing. Help me welcome Shauna Mann, please.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here today. How awesome was day one of the summit? Like Will and Sue, it was my first summit ever at DriverCheck, so it was such a great opportunity to connect with so many like-minded industry professionals, and I can't get over how many Edmontonians we have in the room. Go Oilers, go. So like Jonathan said, I'm going to be speaking about physical abilities testing today. So this is a real passion of mine, and I'm hoping that I can just create or just give you more information about just another puzzle piece in helping to determine fitness for duty. So I once received a message: "You saved my husband's life." Me? No, Shauna, not you, but let me tell you what did. So we had a gentleman who was scheduled for fitness for duty testing. So his testing consisted of drug and alcohol testing, pre-employment medical, and physical abilities testing. So he was in his late 50s, he was a resident of Newfoundland, and he was employed in the industrial construction sector. He passed his drug and alcohol test with no concerns, so then he went on to the medical portion of testing. All of his baseline measurements were okay. His blood pressure was a bit high, but it met our testing thresholds. So we were able to put him through the remainder of testing and go on to the physical abilities portion of testing. Now, during the physical abilities test, he exceeded his maximum heart rate, and the protocols with this specific company were that if you exceeded your maximum heart rate and didn't recover within a specified period of time, testing would actually be stopped, and the individual would have to go off to their physician to get medical clearance to come back to basically to complete testing. So he exceeded his heart rate, testing was stopped. We sent him on his merry way to go see his physician for clearance. Well, the universe had a different plan for that individual that day. So he went to his physician to get medical clearance. Something wasn't resonating with the physician, and actually sent the individual off for additional diagnostic testing. "You saved my husband's life" was an email that we received a few days later after that initial assessment. This individual went in for an emergency quadruple bypass surgery. So physical abilities testing saved this individual's life. And this really is a comprehensive test which outlines a person's abilities to meet the essential demands of the job. And so those essential demands of the job are what we call bona fide occupational requirements. And so they can be defined as essential demands of the job that cannot be accommodated or modified. So essentially, if you cannot perform these bona fide occupational requirements, you really can't do that job. And because there is such a high standard around the test for a bona fide occupational requirement, you as an employer need to ensure that if you are implementing any type of questioning or any type of testing that could preclude an individual from being hired, that you make sure that you're testing to these bona fide occupational requirements. So what does this mean? So if you want to assess somebody's strength to see if they have the necessary strength to do the job. Unless they're a personal fitness trainer and they're gonna be working in a gym, you really shouldn't be assessing their ability to do push-ups, sit-ups, and pull-ups. You really need to make sure that the testing that that person is undergoing, it matches the essential demands of the job and it mirrors those tasks as closely as possible. And it must have a rational connection to the job. These tests are important for so many reasons. They really help contribute to a healthier and safer workforce. By giving employers information about an individual's limitations and abilities so that the employers have the confidence that they're actually placing the right people in the right job. They also have a positive impact on culture because we know that if somebody was to have a medical event or suffer an injury on site, it not only affects that person, but it also has the ability to affect the health and safety of others in the workforce. And lastly, it can prevent a mishire. So Frank, let's take you for example. You're gonna apply for EPCOR. So EPCOR has two options. Option A, my fitness for duty program, drug and alcohol testing. Option B, drug and alcohol plus physical abilities testing. So in option A, Frank comes in for testing. He does his drug and alcohol testing, he passes successfully, he's cleared to go to work. Option B, Frank comes in for testing. He does his drug and alcohol testing, he passes, he goes on to physical abilities testing. So upon clinical examination, Frank has a swollen, sore knee, extreme loss of range of motion, loss of strength, to the point where it would be an actual safety concern if we were to put this individual through testing. So testing is stopped, and we have to give the employer on that testing day that this person is not suitable for work. So you can see how adding a physical abilities testing component changes the recommendation for hire. There really shouldn't be a cookie cutter approach to physical abilities testing, which I'll speak to in a little bit, but there are some things that we really do need to incorporate at a minimum. So at DriverCheck, we use the PAR-Q+. So this is an evidence-based medical evaluation tool to determine somebody's ability to safely participate in exercise. So essentially what it is, it's a screen with 7 questions that really target the individual's cardiovascular health, which is their heart, their neurological health, the nervous system, or the musculoskeletal system, the bones, ligaments, muscles, and tendons. So if the individual answers yes to any of those 7 screening questions, they would then go on to an additional 2 pages of questioning to really tease out if there's a concern for that person to participate in physical activity. If they answer yes to any of those screening questions, they would then be stopped and we'd have to get medical clearance prior to allowing them to go through with testing. We also want to make sure at baseline we've got their resting heart rate and we've got their resting blood pressure, because you obviously know there can be some catastrophic medical events that can happen with physical abilities testing, so we want to make sure at baseline they are at a safe resting heart rate and blood pressure. And in the example of Frank, we want to also make sure that we're doing range of motion assessment at a minimum. And so what that looks like is we want to ensure that the individual has the appropriate range of motion to be able to go through all the functional demands of the testing, because there is a risk that with any type of physical activity, injury can occur. So we need to make sure that we're not putting anybody through that testing inappropriately. And from there, we then go through a series of functional tests. So again, these functional tests that really mirror the job. So we're taking a look at different weights that are lifted, as well as the frequency of that lifting, and then also any other positional mobility tasks, such as kneeling, crouching, overhead reaching, below shoulder reaching. And now if the individual can complete all of those tests safely, they'll then move on to what's called a work simulation. So really what the work simulation is just a compilation of the standardized job demands, and we just clump them together in succession, and for a specified period of time, the individual will go through those stations. And so the purpose of this is essentially we want to try to mirror a typical workday as closely as possible. And so I've seen, again, depending on the scope of work, 20 minutes to, I think the longest one I've seen is about an hour and 5 minutes. And then upon that completion, that's when you as an employer are then going to get the information. Is this person, do they meet the demands for work? Do they not? Or are there some limitations advised? Okay, so we now know what a physical abilities test is. We now know we have to hold it to the standard of a bona fide occupational requirement. But does anybody know, how do we get there? How do we actually develop the test? What's an important piece of that puzzle? Yes, so a job demands analysis. Okay, so basically, according to the Occupational Health Clinics for Ontario Workers, it's a systematic approach to quantify and evaluate all of the physical and the environmental demands of the essential and non-essential tasks of the job. So it's really a way of establishing a job in its entirety which complies with the Human Rights Code, and it's the cornerstone in the analytical process of determining compatibility between a worker and the job. So it's a really great definition when we're taking a look at physical demands of the job, but when we're looking at a job in its entirety, we know it needs to go beyond that. So it really should include a cognitive demands analysis, which Anthony spoke to yesterday. It's important for employers to know what are the memory requirements of the job, judgment, performance pressures, decision making. So all of that is important, that is captured in that. Now, we're not at a point where during physical abilities testing we're capturing that, but I trust in the future, just due to the cutting edge research that Empirica and the University of Alberta is doing, that we will eventually get to one point where we can include a cognitive piece in this pre-employment aspect. I'd also like to mention that a JDA is not a requirement, so it's not regulated by any means, but as an employer, again, because of the high standard of the test for a bona fide occupational requirement, if you are wanting to implement any of this type of testing, this is a very, very important tool to help you get there. And I'd also like to mention is you shouldn't have a one blanket PDA for your entire organization, okay? You need to really break it down by job position, and you need to have the individual job demands analysis for each position. And they should be audited at a minimum of every 2 years or earlier if the scope of work changes. So recommendation that these be independent in nature as well, so performed by a qualified professional who would actually go onto your job site. They would tag along with a skilled employee or a supervisor or a foreman. And there's quite an intensive interview process so that we can really get a true description of what does this job look like its entirety. We also want to get a breakdown of what are the essential tasks as well as the non-essential tasks. Because remember, this is a report that's going to speak to the job in its entirety. But as an employer, you cannot test for the non-essential tasks. So these are tasks that you really don't need to be able to do to perform your job, or they're tasks that are shared amongst multiple employees. But they can be really important when you are trying to return somebody back to work, and if they're in a modified capacity, some of these non-essential tasks might be a really meaningful way for them to stay engaged and in the workforce. We also get an idea of what like equipments, weights, tools are being used, and we actually take a physical scale and we weigh those so that we can get a sense of when we're trying to determine the lifting limits for the test, well, how much should we be doing, and then also the frequency that they're lifting that. And then we also take a look at the manual handling, the positional demands, the dexterity demands, the sensory and perception demands. So, you know, if you're going to be implementing vision testing, and color vision is an essential part of that job because they need to see traffic lights or they need to be able to code certain wires, and you want to do color vision as part of your screening. Well, again, this is a piece of that puzzle that can help you do so. And then the psychological demands, which I already spoke to. And then we take photos and videos and we embed those in the body of the report so that we have a real visual cue of the type of work that's actually being done. And a good report should also contain identification of work hazards, especially in the absence of some organizations not having robust health and safety departments. We want to really help identify those hazards, and then considering the hierarchy of control, making some of those recommendations on how we can mitigate that. And then once we've compiled all of that data together, we then also want to make a further recommendation as to about, based on the bona fide occupational requirements of the job, well, what are some other types of testing that you actually may want to incorporate to make sure that you're bringing the right person into the right job? So these have so many advantages. So obviously, we know one of those advantages is that it's going to help direct our testing protocol. So if we've got a valid JDA, we can now know that we can base our testing parameters on that protocol. Some additional advantages of these, it's a really great tool to use in your hiring process. So I've worked alongside some organizations who've actually, when they have interested candidates in the role, they present the report to the candidate. And some candidates have actually self-selected themselves out of the hiring process because once they truly understood the scope of that work, they're like, no, this isn't for me. This is not what I expected this job to be. And as a physiotherapist, they weren't often provided, but when they were, it was a very valuable tool to help guide our treatment programs because, again, or even to the doctor. So anybody who's responsible for a continuum of care for someone who's injured on the job site or even in a non-OC injury, you really want to provide this report to the healthcare provider. This can give them a wealth of information. So if you've got somebody who has a shoulder injury and they're going to be pulling wires overhead all day, it doesn't make sense to do a rehab program where they're doing bicep curls and TheraBand exercises below shoulder height. We really want to tailor those exercise programs to that. And then likewise, when we're considering return to work or modified work, this again can really serve as an objective tool so that we're making really informed decisions when somebody goes back to work. So we can really benchmark against that. They can also help you as an employer if you do not hire somebody and somebody claims discrimination. So you can use this in the court of law to serve as part of your defense, because if you have a JDA and you benchmarked your physical abilities testing protocols to that JDA, you're going to have a higher likelihood of success in that case. And the last one that I'd like to mention is it can actually help determine the legitimacy of a WCB claim. So I'd like to share a real life example. So I did a handful of job demands analysis for a large contractor in the industrial construction sector. And so completed the reports, and I have to sign off, put all my contact information on there. So I actually received a phone call from a WCB physician, and he said, I just want to let you know, Shauna, that due to the comprehensiveness of this report, we actually denied an individual's repetitive strain injury claim because it was so granular, where we went into even the cycles per hour where some of these repetitive tasks were formed, that they were based on the bona fide occupational requirements. There is no way that work could have been a contributing factor to that. Later came out in the wash that the individual was a guitarist in a band and he practiced for several hours a night, and that was likely the contributing factor. All right, so you've got a great physical abilities testing program. You've got a great JDA that supports that. We're off to the races, right? Not quite. As a company who wants to implement this testing, it's really important that you know what your obligations are as somebody who's going to be receiving this information and determining where you want to place this worker. So some of this was spoke about yesterday, so I think in 2 presentations, so 3rd time's the charm. We'll really hammer it home today. So as an employer, you have a duty of care, you have a duty to accommodate, and the bona fide occupational requirements. So under the Federal Criminal Code, employers and employees may be criminally liable if they were to cause death or serious harm on the job site. So the duty of persons directing work clause under the Federal Criminal Code indicates that anybody who's engaged in or has the authority to direct work has the legal responsibility to take the necessary steps to ensure that they prevent any bodily harm on the job site to that person or any other persons engaged in the job site. Similarly, under federal and provincial occupational health and safety statutes, employers and their employees are also jointly responsible for the health and safety of their workers. Under federal and provincial human rights statutes, employers have the obligation of the duty to accommodate in those events that people cannot meet an employment standards on any protected ground. So those protected grounds might be disability, it might be age, gender, familial status, religion, to the point of undue hardship. So what this means for you as an employer is that you might actually have to adjust your employee policies, rules, practices, even the way that work is done if it's on this protected ground. And the only valid considerations in determining undue hardship are cost, outside funding, and health and safety, which is very important. But the law recognizes that the limitations on individual rights may be exercised if they're reasonable and justifiable, and that also discrimination or exclusion may be allowed if the individual cannot meet the bona fide occupational requirements of the job. So I'm just going to jump forward just to a little bit of case law, and then we'll go back. So the Miorin case really set the precedent for a bona fide occupational requirement. And so just to kind of Cole's Notes version this, she was a female firefighter hired by the British Columbia government, and she'd been employed in that role for 3 years. So the British Columbia government decided to adopt a new aerobic fitness standard for firefighters. And so all of their current employees were required to go through this fitness standard. Now, she attempted the test 3 times. She was unsuccessful, and she was dismissed from her role. And so she claimed discrimination on the grounds of she was already employed successfully in that role for 3 years, and she also claimed that women generally have a lower aerobic capacity, and therefore it was discrimination based on gender. The government argued that no, this actually was a bona fide occupational requirement, and then the Supreme Court, they overruled and they determined that it actually did not have a rational connection to the job, and it was not necessary for the performance of her job. Similarly, in the Rubbermaid Canada case, this was where the union grieved So a company who implemented pre-employment functional testing and was utilizing some of the workers from the hiring hall, the union agreed that it was a discriminatory practice. However, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled in the employer's favor that indicated that there were some necessary physical requirements of that job, that it was reasonable to test to that standard to make sure that people had the necessary strength and conditioning to do the job being applied for. So as an organization who wants to implement physical abilities testing, you must prove on a balance of probabilities 3 things. So that the test has a rational connection to the job, that it was developed in an honest and good faith belief, and that it was reasonably necessary. So what this means is that there is no way that that person can be accommodated to the point of undue hardship. So I hope you can see here now that by having a job demands analysis, it's really going to help you meet the standard for bona fide occupational requirements. And I hope you can see how a job demands analysis and a physical abilities test is going to help give you more information in your duty to accommodate. And you can see how a physical abilities test can help meet the duty of care to make sure, as one of those steps that you're taking to reduce bodily harm on the job site. So litigiously, you can now implement this testing at the time of hire. You can also implement it that if anybody wants, if you have a new job classification that requires additional physical demands, you can implement it at that point to make sure the people can meet the bona fide occupational requirement. And you can also implement it at the time of return to work. So it's a really great tool that if you have medical clearance that the individual is safe to return to work, put them through this test to really make sure that they've got the physical abilities to be able to return to work. So the last thing that I'd just like to highlight on is a lot of us are interested in numbers, and so I often get a lot of questions. Well, what's in it for me? What's my return on investment on this? So I don't really have a hard and fast answer for that, but I'm hoping that I can share a few guiding principles with you. So according to Dr. Ben Hoffman, who's the Chief Medical Officer at WorkStep, so it's a US-based functional testing organization similar to DriverCheck, he's indicated that this type of testing can help reduce claim costs and injury costs by 50%. So how? His response is that generally people who go through this testing are healthier and they're more fit. And we know that healthier people and more fit people, they have a reduced likelihood of injury. But I want to make, there's a couple caveats to that. Accidents happen. Just because somebody goes through testing doesn't mean they're never going to get injured. If a 200-pound piece of pipe falls on an individual's leg, no matter how healthy and fit they are, they're likely going to sustain a fracture to that leg. And I also want to make mention that this test is not to be used as a predictive tool. This is a snapshot in time. So we are assessing that person's ability to work in that moment in time. So what that means is if Johnny's injured his back a year ago, we can't make a prediction that because he's injured his back, he's going to injure it again, and provide that information to the company and that potentially impact their hiring decision. So again, it really needs to be that snapshot in time. Secondly, I'm sure you are all aware of your workers' compensation premiums being impacted by claims experience, industry performance, historical data and trends. So it's similar to if you're in a car accident. What happens? Your insurance premiums goes up. People get injured at your work site. Your claims premiums go up. And the important thing to remember is that based on that claims experience, those claims premiums can follow you around for a period of time, and specifically to Ontario, that's 5 years. So there really is a high degree of incentivization for employers to be implementing initiatives to bring on healthier people to work. And we also need to consider that the cost of the claim doesn't just include the lost time claims. We need to factor in the indirect costs, so hiring, retraining, accident investigation, loss of productivity, and then taking into consideration the revenue margins to actually cover that cost of a claim. So you can see how on paper what maybe started out as a $10,000 direct medical cost claim can now be almost $100,000 or more in claim costs, and it can close some business enterprises down. And I'd like to wrap things up by speaking to, in my opinion, one of the most important return on investments. So this is a story that's very near and dear, so I hope I can hold it together. So I was actually the clinical examiner for this individual. And so on paper, I reviewed his medical history, everything. I was like, oh, this is going to be a super easy assessment. Go in, everything is fine, start doing my objective assessment. So he had significantly marked reduction of range of motion in his shoulder. So put my physio hat on, and I start doing some additional special testings to see if I could really clue into what was going on in that shoulder. And so I believe he had a massive rotator cuff tear with some of the labral involvement. And so I knew I was going to have to tell this individual that testing was stopped for the day. So these conversations were never easy to have. The common, I've got bills to pay, I've got mouths to feed, like this is my livelihood, like I need to go to work. So tough conversations to have with people. So I told this individual, like, this is what I think is going on. I actually think we need to get you through the medical system and you need to get an MRI. And in my opinion, he was likely would be a surgical candidate. And so, trust me, I've been called many things when I've been telling people when they're stopped, and his response was, thank you. And I said, pardon me? He said, thank you. He said, I've been suffering mentally, I've been suffering physically, no one has listened to me. I'm now having to apply for jobs that are outside of my trade, I'm not passionate about. He's like, I feel like my livelihood has been taken away. He said, I'm so appreciative that you took the time to investigate my shoulder. So I sent him off with a big doctor's note, and a few months later, he contacted me, and he said, I just want to let you know that I'm scheduled for surgery. So, in my opinion, the biggest wealth here is health, and that is something that you can't put a price on. So I'd like to leave you all with one question today. What is one thing you're doing today to contribute to a healthier and safer workforce tomorrow? Thank you.